what we want to look at essentially is converting spiritual insights into practical execution frameworks. So one of the things that we've learned clearly today is from faith and identity, purpose is derived. When it comes to purpose, in terms of what God has for us to do practically across, like, on earth, across the various fields and sectors we find ourselves, when it comes to that, what we want to consider in this session is how do you convert spiritual insight, spiritual knowledge into practical executable frameworks. So say, for example, you wake up one morning with a burden, right, to reach 1 million people, 1 million souls, for example, and the way you feel the burden, it's probably you feel the Lord is leading you to start a business or to start a brand. How do you go from that spiritual burden, that purpose, into execution without losing sight of the call, without losing sight of what the original purpose was? And it's a pleasure to have you, sir, as well on the session. Right about now, I would begin with this first question. How do you handle sessions? How do you handle seasons when you are not, when it feels like you're not hearing anything new from God, but you still need to make decisions? How do you handle that?
All right. Excuse me. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and a delight to be here. Can I ask somebody to please help me with my water? I forgot it there. Thank you. So the question is, how do we handle seasons when it's as though we're not hearing from God, when we're not hearing, or it's as though God is not speaking to us? And I think that's something that is not uncommon. I think in many of our lives there are times, there are instances where it seems as though God is silent on certain things. So what do you do in those kind of moments when maybe you want to take a decision? Maybe you're a student, you're going into university, you have options. How do you know where to go? How do you know what to do? So I think these are some practical things in our lives. There are sometimes when we listen to very spiritual brethren speak, it's almost as though God speaks to them per second. You know, they just sit down and then, and maybe it does happen, but I know that quite often there are moments and periods where there seems to be God wanting you to act based on what he has already told you before. In those kind of situations when you have to take a decision, I think one of the key things, and I listened to some of the discussions earlier, one of the key things to do is to examine your heart, examine the motives of your heart. Why do you want to do the things that you're thinking to do? Because you know you can actually do a good thing and do it for the wrong reason. And you don't necessarily get much credit in heaven for that. And so the condition or the desire of the heart has to be right. The motives for which you want to take that decision or do that thing you want to do has to be right. So how do you know when a motive is right? If the motive is all about you, you can just know that it's wrong. If it's just all about you, it is wrong. It has to be bigger than you. It has to be that there's value that you're bringing to people other than yourself. That's important. And so we examine the heart, we see what's going on in the heart. And it sounds simple. But the Bible says that the heart of a man is desperately wicked and deceitful, and many people's hearts lie to them. It's not difficult to lie to yourself. It's not difficult at all. And so that's an important thing. Before we even go to ask God what we should do, please always check your heart. You know, if you have preconceived ideas and you already have notions of this is what is good for me to do, and then you're asking God for his will, chances are you will hear something, but it's probably not his will. What you will hear will just reinforce what you already wanted to do. So the heart disposition is extremely important. I'll go through a few other things. So we've talked about the heart. And of course, then there is the need to ask God again, pray and ask for guidance, ask for understanding, ask for wisdom. And because you need that, even if he's not going to be audibly speaking to you, praying that in that manner will set up the rest of the process to help you narrow down on what God's will is. And then let me back up a little bit. You remember in the Old Testament, and it's a similar thing for us even today, there are times that God would just come and he would tell people specifically, Moses would be able to tell what God is saying. There are other times that God's mind is not clearly communicated that way, and they have this system of casting lots. I don't know if you remember. And so they want to know what is God's will on a matter. And so they will cast lots. They will cast lots by tribe, by clan, by family, and then the individual or the final answer will come out. So there's a process that is akin to that, where when God's mind is not explicitly stated, there's a process that we as believers can go through that is almost like casting lots, where you arrive at what the decision is. And so that process, like I say, starts with the examination of the heart. It then continues with you committing what your decision-making process to the Lord. And then it's also then important that we should also use our brains. Being spiritual doesn't mean that we suspend mental activity. God has given us brains, isn't it? And he's given the brains for us to use. But not to, as we walk through things, so what do I mean by that? You're trying to take a decision. You weigh the pros and the cons of the decision that you're trying to make. You would also remember previous things that the Lord has said to you. You would also remember scriptural patterns or scriptural principles that may speak to the decision that you're trying to make or the circumstances. And you would also remember, and I think I heard it earlier today, there are patterns that you would be able to recognize in your life. If you're paying attention to your life, there are certain patterns that you would have been identifying with time. So you put all of those things together as you think through this decision that you need to make. So those are some of the things that I would say. I would also say that it's also important to seek counsel. Seek wise counsel. The Bible says in the multitude of counselors, there's safety. So seek counsel from people who have some experience, maybe in the area that you're contemplating matters on. People that have some spiritual insight, people that are a little bit more mature than you. Now, bear in mind that in seeking the counsel, it's not that you're asking people for permission. It's that people sometimes are able to help you see some of your blind spots. So while you're trying to make a decision, sometimes you don't see the blind spots that are around you. Another person who knows you, who understands the situation, is able to point out some things that you would have missed. So you take all of that into consideration. And then you make the decision based on all of that. You make the decision based on you having all this input and deciding what is best. And as you're making that decision, you're speaking to the Lord and saying, this is what I'm going to do. And you're asking the Lord for his blessing. And you're proceeding with the confidence that even if maybe in all of this, you may have made a mistake, God is going to bring you back to the path because you did it with a proper heart. You did it taking into account the principles of Scripture. You did it with a desire to glorify his name. And so you then have the confidence to go ahead. But the challenge sometimes is that we want to wait until we have the full picture before we set out.
Right. Can we clap? So many nuggets, and I hope we've been able to pick out a few things, basically. Sir, you've founded companies, you've worked in over 10 countries across Europe, Africa, and more. You've, provided employment for thousands of persons, over 1,000 persons. You have, seasoned entrepreneur, investor, and more. But at the foundation of that has been God, has been Christ. And so the next question basically is, when it comes to the startup world or product world, we have something called an MVP, which is the minimum viable product, right? So in terms of moving from spiritual insight into execution, what is the most important, most critical, basic first step that the believer needs to do? And I'd like you to be as practical as possible. This is applying spiritual insights into the practical world, career, business, and more. So from spiritual insights, spiritual purpose, spiritual direction, what's the first, most critical, most basic next step that needs to happen?
All right, using the analogy that you have given with regard to MVP, I guess that's essentially where you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's essentially where you would have a basic product that you want to bring out efficiently to the market. You have not developed the product features to a significant extent, and you expect the market to provide feedback as a product. Is that correct? Okay. So, and so the idea there is you don't have all the information. You're setting out to get things done. From the perspective of translating vision into action, it's very, very similar. And I think I heard Chinasa talk about it when she was talking about her writing. Just do it. So and I mentioned it earlier, our challenge many times is we want to have the full picture before we set out. And God seldom operates that way, because that also takes away the element of faith. So quite often what God will do, even when he gives you a clear vision, and God gave me a clear vision in my life, when I was in my third year in university, it was already very clear to me what I was going to do with my life. And it was something that God communicated to me almost audibly. So that matter was settled. But I understand that that's not always the way that God communicates things. But even in spite of having a clear vision of the direction, because the vision is kind of where you gives you insight into where you're heading to the end state. It's something that is aspirational. So you can have a very clear vision, know, like in the example we're giving, you know that where you're supposed to end up is Sokoto. Okay, but today you're in Lagos. So you know you're supposed to go to Sokoto. How do you then begin that journey? Important thing is directionally, you know where you're supposed to be, know where you're supposed to be going. The next important thing is do something now with what you already have. You don't necessarily need to wait for too much more revelation, because quite often what will happen is that God waits for you to take a step before he now begins to unveil what next you should do. So take the first step that you can see. And as you step out in faith, and that has been my experience, as you step out in faith, he then begins to show you what the next steps are in the journey. Now, maybe later I'll talk about planning and all of that. So there's a place for planning. There's a place for sitting down and trying to put plans together. But even when you put the plans together, there's sometimes people suffer from, what do you call it, paralysis, analysis paralysis. I mean, they want to plan until they've got everything perfect, and by the time they finish planning and getting everything perfect, the door of opportunity has closed. And that's the whole idea here. You want to take advantage of being timely to execute something. So start the execution with the limited information, the limited light that you have, with a heart's disposition of being willing to learn and being open to receive from God. And I think as long as you do that, you'll be fine.
Great, thank you. Straight to the point. Can you tell us a time when deep spiritual conviction led you to take an unconventional or high-risk, decision in your career or business? And how did you go about this? So a practical situation or instance? Okay. Yeah.
No, I mean, there have been many times when, based on the conviction that God has given, one has done something that common sense advises you not to do. That's why when you also seek counsel from people, you're not obligated to take the counsel. Because there are sometimes people give you counsel and God gives you different insight. And you do what God tells you to do. So even if I'm the most experienced person in a matter and I'm giving counsel on the matter, if God gives you insight that is different from the counsel that I've given you and you know it's God, please do what he has asked you to do. You will not offend me by not taking my advice. In fact, I'll be quite pleased. So there have been times when, one example is in terms of career. I was in Nigeria at the time, in Lagos. I had a good job here, a well-paying job, good profile within the organization, and they were preparing me for greater things in the organization. And they said that what they then needed to do before I could come back to Nigeria and take greater responsibility was to go to Malaysia and become a director responsible for certain operations in Southeast Asia. But at that time, I did not feel that was what God wanted me to do. And so I said, no, I don't want to take that job. And then they said, well, we don't really have anything for you in Nigeria. So the fact of the matter is that you either take that job or you leave. And I said, I would rather leave. And it's not as if I had a job that I was going to do. So I left, and I then started, that was my first attempt at starting a business. And the business failed, and so I went back to look for a job. So, and I think it was a humiliating experience because at some point I didn't have a job. The business had failed. I hadn't got a job again. My wife was the breadwinner in the family. So you can imagine somebody coming from a point where I was a high flyer in an organization, and now I'm collecting pocket money from my wife. So sometimes doing what you're convicted to do, and this is important, the fact that you're obeying what you believe is God's mind for you doesn't mean that the outcome is always going to be favorable. The outcome can be different from what you expect. However, now with the benefit of hindsight, when I look back at what happened and the lessons I learned through that process, even though I'm not happy to go through that kind of process again, I'm very grateful to God that I went through it because I learned certain things that I think it would have been very difficult to learn any other way. And those things became useful for my subsequent success. So that's an example, and I can give several more.
Awesome, very great example. Okay, so at some point towards the end, we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, you can start to note that down. Either you're called to speak or you put it in the notes which be sent to me. Thank you, sir. So moving on to another aspect. I don't have data for this, but let me crave our indulgence to say a lot of Christians seem to struggle with the balance between relying on God's grace and being diligent and excellent in execution, right? And so for some persons, it's either this or that, both of them being mutually exclusive. So for yourself, having played at very, very high levels and frequencies across career and business, how would you describe managing that balance? Or how do you process God's grace, letting it do its work, and also being diligent and being excellent in whatever is put in your hands to do?
All right, thank you. So what is grace? And usually the answer would be unmerited favor. One of the ways I look at it is, you know how Ecclesiastes says that time and chance happen to us all. I look at grace as the skewing of time and chance in your favor. So things happen, but for you, the things that will happen will have more of a tendency to favor you than not favor you. So when God's grace is upon your life. So another way of looking at it is that God's grace causes more events that have a possibility of a positive outcome to happen in an individual's life. But if you don't do anything with the grace, you don't get any useful result. I mean, even when we talk about the grace that enables us to be saved, you also have to do something with saving grace. Saving grace is available to everybody, but it's only those people that do something with it that get some result, isn't it? As a minimum, you believe, and then you confess. So grace, the way I look at that is, it can open doors of opportunity for you. It can get you into rooms where you can engage people that can transform your lives. It can help for your name to be mentioned in meetings that you don't have access to. All of those kind of things are expressions of grace. But if a door of opportunity is open and you have not been prepared to take advantage of that open door, it's as though the grace is of no effect. So this is where diligence comes in. Because sometimes as believers, we're not diligent. We have some attitude that seems to indicate, well, God is just going to do what he's going to do. It's as though we don't have a part to play. One of the things I would also like to say is that because this is important. When I was growing up as a believer, part of the theology that I was exposed to was that making it to heaven is all that matters. We're not really too bothered about what's going on here on earth. So, that sounds nice, but there's a danger in that theology. Because if all I'm concerned about is going to heaven, and I don't think that my life is supposed to have an influence and an impact on this life, on this earth, guess what? The people who are evil are constantly strategizing on how to promote their agenda here on earth. And so while we were busy praying and being fully heavenly minded, they were introducing things about being gay and being lesbian in our schools. We were not attending Parent-Teachers Association meetings because we're all heavenly minded people. We were not engaging the way we should be engaging with society around us. And then by the time we realized what was going on, the satanic agenda had already gotten such a strong foothold that it was difficult to react. Now we're in a reactive mode when we could have been in a proactive mode and making sure that the agenda of the kingdom of God is what is being introduced in the schools, is what is being introduced in the different places where we have influence. So it's important that we see ourselves as people who are extending the influence of God's kingdom. And what are the areas in which we know that we're extending God's influence? And I think the minister spoke about some of those things today. But the way I look at it is pretty simple. There has to be fruitfulness, there's multiplication, and then there's the ability to exercise dominion. In everywhere that we are, our life should be fruitful. I mean, Jesus was talking about the nation of Israel, and he says, I'm taking the kingdom away from you because you're not producing the fruits thereof. In each of our lives, God is looking for fruit. And the question is, are we producing that fruit? I know that I'm speaking a little bit more than what was asked, but I wanted to weave that in because I see a lot of young people here. And please know that as you progress in life, see yourselves as ambassadors of God's kingdom. Now, sometimes you have believers, you're in an office, and your colleagues don't even know that you're a believer. And it's not because you have to preach to people. It's by your conduct, by your character, by how you carry yourself, by how you do your work. So in terms of diligence, coming back now to the place of diligence versus grace, when you're at work, you should be working as though it's a service unto God. Somebody is a believer who is supposed to be going to work. You dodge from work because you're going for a prayer meeting. That does not glorify God. God is not glorified by the fact, because you're robbing your employer. You're actually a thief at that moment. Even though your activity of theft it's like somebody stealing money to go and pay tithes. So there's the need to be diligent, to exercise excellence in our standards. Hold yourself to a high expectation. Hold people around you to a high expectation. And that in itself is a message.
Awesome. Thank you very much, sir. Because of time, I would ask one more question, which I hope you can answer in quickly, a minute, 3 minutes, and then we'll take 1 or 2 quick questions from the audience. I know. Okay. All right. So going ahead with the question, if God gives anyone in this hall a vision that feels bigger than their current capacity, what would be your prescribed, ways to deal with doubts and, faithlessness that might want to arise from the size of that vision, from experience?
I think that usually when God gives you a vision of what he wants you to do, or a vision of what he wants to accomplish through your life, usually by my experience is that if the vision doesn't shock you, then I don't know. It's probably then you could have just done it by your own strength. Usually, he would ask you to do something that you don't have the capacity in yourself to do, because if you have the capacity, then you don't need his help, as it were. Let me put it that way. So he usually would show you something, ask you to do something that it's not within you to accomplish by yourself, and therefore you need divine help. So, but in needing divine help, it doesn't take away your responsibility to do the things that you can do. So there's a part that God does, which we've talked about, grace, for example. There's a part that you need to do. The way I look at this thing sometimes is that, so when we speak about grace, for example, an analogy you can use is, grace is like the wind. And you have this boat. And you doing the things that you're supposed to do is like having a sail. So you can have the wind blowing as much as it needs to blow, but if the sail is not set in the right direction, in fact, sometimes the wind can blow the boat to the wrong place if the sail is not finely tuned. But then if you have a sail with no wind, you also will not make much progress. So when God gives a vision, he quite often doesn't tell you all the steps that it's going to take to accomplish that vision. But quite often, you would know what is the next step you can take. There's always something that God has placed in your hand. And as we had said before, as you start it, it becomes clearer. Now, what the enemy will do sometimes is that doubt and fear, he would begin to say, is it God that really told this to you? Are you sure that you can do this? Look at that person and that person and that person who tried to do it and see how they failed. What makes you different? Why do you think you can do it? I wasn't the first Nigerian to try and set up a drilling company the way that we set it up, but it had always ended in failure. So why did I then think I could do it? And that's where the conviction that you have from the beginning comes in. One of the most important things as believers that we should learn is to be able to recognize God's voice. And so Jesus talks about his sheep, they know his voice. It's like a child knowing the voice of the mother. Once God has spoken to you about a matter and you know it is from God, then you should be able to stake your life on that matter. That's why for me, it's very rare for me to say that God has told me something. I would rather say that I have an impression from God when I'm not 100% sure, even if I'm 99% sure. But there are certain things that God has told me, and I'm 100% sure, and I'm willing to die for those things. So if God has told me something, and I know this is God, even when I'm going through the process and things are not going the way they should go, and there's fear and there's doubt, who told me? God. So it says, let God be true, and let every man be a liar.
Thank you so much, sir. So we're wrapping up now. We have two questions for the audience, but I want to throw in this one, and I think it's important. We've touched on execution, going from insight to execution, basically in the framework, and then the outcome. I want us to talk about the outcome.
Sorry, before we talk about the outcome, can I just also share some practical insights into how we can execute stuff? When I'm executing, I often break things down into an operational level, a tactical level. This is what works for me. It's not something that a tactical level and a strategic level. So the strategic level is what you're speaking about, the vision. It's a long-term thing. But then you're here, you're going there. So the strategic level is what is over there. The operational level is what do I need to do now? But whatever you're doing now, you don't take your eyes off from the direction you're going. And then there's also what I call the tactical level, which is what do I need to do in the midterm? So there's what do I need to do in the short term? And usually what you need to do in the short term, you already have the equipping to do that. And so many times it's just for you to look at what is in your hand and use what is in your hand and start the journey. And while you're doing that, you're looking at what do I need to do in the midterm? And the midterm can be 2 to 5 years. That will allow me get further along the journey that God is calling me to journey with him. Now this is important. The reason I share that is I was at a meeting in the UK, I think about a month ago, and we're talking about some of these things and realized that some believers don't even believe in planning. They don't sit down and think of how am I going to plan something that I'm going to do in the next 2 to 5 years. And it was almost sounding like I was very carnal for talking about planning. But planning is important. But you plan with the understanding that God can change your plans. But that doesn't mean you should not have a plan. Have a plan, but have the humility to know that God can alter your plan. Okay, I just wanted to chip that in.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. In 30 seconds, 1 minute, having now gotten the insight, having now executed, how do you differentiate spiritual success versus worldly success? Let me give an instance. 10 years ago, there was a body and a vision. You executed, started a company. 10 years now, you're closing, let's say, a 10 million naira deal, right? You get rich and all that stuff. How do you manage?
Was that naira or dollar? If it's naira, you've set us back.
Dollars. So $10 million deal, right? So how do you, considering that this was bettered by a spiritual vision, right? How do you differentiate between spiritual success and worldly success? How do you ensure you don't get carried away with the worldly success? And from experience, like how do you basically manage that as a believer?
I think one of the key things is to be grounded in, we've been talking about identity, be grounded in your identity as a believer. And if you are, you don't necessarily measure success by the same metrics that the world measures success. Remember, the reason that we do the things that we do is not necessarily to generate financial wealth, even though that is good, but it's more from the perspective of influence. I can go into rooms today that I could not go 10 years ago, but if I go into those rooms and I'm not influencing the conversation in those rooms for good, then my being there is useless. There was no point God blessing me. God did not bless me just so that I'm blessed. He blesses so that when you have access to certain places, you can influence the conversations in those places. As believers, success for me is how fruitful are you being in relation to God's expectations of your life. That's key. And the yardstick to measure fruitfulness is defined by God. So when he's also giving a vision, many times he would indicate to you what he's looking for in that. The whole world can be clapping that you're achieving something, but from God's perspective, you've been an utter failure.
Thank you so much, sir. We're wrapping up in 2-3 minutes now. I see our host already be cutting me eyes. There's 2 quick questions from the audience. Hopefully you can take them in 1 minute each. In your quest for purpose and ambition, how do you ensure not to miss the mark? Mark in the sense of what the vision is all about. I'm just in 1 minute. I think you've touched some details there, but just in.
Let me just put it this way. Wherever you are in your walk with the Lord, for me, I take inspiration from Daniel. There are many times that I want to, it's like I may be getting distracted. I think I don't have time to do the things that I need to do. No matter where you are in your walk with the Lord, you know how they used to teach us in Sunday school. Read your Bible, pray every day. If you want to, grow. So it's still that simple. It's still that basic. Read your Bible and pray every day. In other words, have daily communion and fellowship with the Lord. There are some times in my experience I would have back-to-back meetings. I'm traveling, I have all kinds of things I'm doing, and it's like, oh, I can't find the time to do what I need to do. And then I remember Daniel, and Daniel was a prime minister. And I said, I'm not even prime minister. And Daniel will pray 3 times a day. I said, no, you better behave yourself. And I will instruct myself to do what I'm supposed to do. And if it means I don't attend some meetings, I will not attend the meeting. Because if you don't remain consistent in fellowship with the Lord, you will miss it. It's very, very easy to begin to compromise once you lose that final vital connection. And you can justify the compromise. I'll just give you a quick example as we round up. I had a situation where we were deploying a vessel. We had gotten a contract award from one of the oil and gas majors. But as it is in Nigeria, because of the nature of the contract, the size of the contract, you needed the government approval. And so you needed one of the regulatory bodies to approve the contract, even though we had been awarded the contract. And they were sitting on our approval. And we went to see the fellow sitting on the approval, and he shamelessly made a demand for bribe. And it's not uncommon. But we had told ourselves from the beginning that we would not run our organization the way the typical Nigerian oil and gas organization is run. We will never compromise on this. We'll rather walk away, lose a contract, than give anybody a bribe. And this guy sat on it. He was asking us for $50,000. I'll just put the numbers there. Sat on it, refused to. We had already started deploying people. We had hired close to 100 people from about 20 countries already. The vessel was coming into Nigeria. We're spending money every day. So the guy knew we were under pressure. And he delayed this thing that it cost us about $5 million because we did not pay somebody $50,000. So if you really need to be convicted and have a standing on a daily basis with the Lord, because it's very easy to give him the $50,000 and then I can justify it. I say, after all, it saved about 100 people their jobs. It's easy to justify when you compromise, but you need consistent, vital fellowship so that you don't compromise.
Awesome. Can we clap? I mean, that's really... this final question is in the light of circumstances of inclusivity. It's not just entering. Anyhow, we understand, right? In the light of that thing, in the secular workspace, how can a Christian manage it? I think the person is asking about like inclusion and all of the agendas around that and stuff. So,
No, I didn't quite get the question. In light of inclusivity,
sorry. Okay, identity. Okay, their identity in environments that contradict Christ. Okay, gender identity. You're working in a space where they, them, she, her, he goats, and stuff like that. And you're working in that kind of place. How do you manage as a Christian? Yes.
So the fundamental thing that we should remember is that we're to love, regardless of what the people are like, whether we like them, we don't like them, whether we believe what they believe, we don't believe them. We are called by God to love, okay? And God demonstrated that for us. It says the world was at enmity against God, yet God so loved the world. The challenge that we have as believers sometimes is we tie the people's behavior intricately to them, such that because we so terribly abhor the behavior and the behavior is abhorrent, we find it difficult to love them. You cannot reach somebody who you don't love. And many times we come with these people with a sense of judgment. And then we forget that it's by grace that we too have been saved. Sin doesn't have gradation, so they're lesbian, they are gay. You also were doing the one that you were doing. But what saved you? Grace. And so when you approach them with the disposition that I love you, I don't agree with what you're doing, and model Christ in your behavior, that's the best way to make a statement in that kind of environment.
Thank you so much. Can we clap? We've come to the end of the fireside chats, and I think it's been a good one. Thank you so much, sir.
My
I'm most
pleasure.
grateful.